20 years after the war, Earl Jennings had nothing left but guilt and an old truck in the desert, until a stray shepherd clawed at the earth and revealed what he'd buried long ago, his military medal, and a letter from his mother reminding him what truly makes a man whole. Some wounds never close, until kindness opens them again. If you believe love can outlive even the dust, like this story, subscribe and tell me what moment stayed with you most. The Nevada desert at dusk looked like the end of the world, flat, endless and bleeding orange under a tired sun. Heat rose off the sand in slow, trembling waves, making the horizon seem alive, like something breathing just out of reach. The air was dry enough to sting the back of the throat. The only sound was the soft ticking of an old Ford truck, cooling after another day that had gone nowhere. Earl Jennings sat inside it motionless. The truck was more rusty than paint, now its bed littered with empty cans, spare bolts, and yesterday's failures. He'd been living out of it for months. Maybe a year he had stopped keeping track when the calendar stopped mattering. 53 years old skin like cracked leather beard, gone gray before its time he carried the kind of silence that weighed more than words ever could. It was the silence of a man who'd seen too much, lost too much, and come home to nothing. He leaned back in the seat, eyes half closed, chewing on a toothpick, pretending not to feel the gnawing hunger in his gut. The sun sank lower. A dry wind whistled through the gaps in the doorframe, carrying the faint scent of sage and dust. Then something moved. Just beyond the truck's shadow, a shape staggered out of the heat, shimmer a dog. Big, skeletal, with fur the color of burnt wheat and eyes sharp as glass. It moved slow, deliberately, each step uncertain but determined. Earl squinted hand instinctively, drifting to the wrench on the passenger seat. Out here, wild animals were desperate, and desperate things did stupid things. But this one didn't snarl. It stopped a few yards away, panting, hard ribs showing through its coat tail hanging limp. The dog just stood there watching him. Two survivors measuring each other in the dying light. "You're lost too, huh?" Earl muttered, voice rough like gravel. The dog didn't move. Its eyes followed every flick of his fingers. He reached into the glove box, pulled out half a piece of bread he'd been saving for breakfast. "All right," he sighed, tossing it out the window. "Don't say I never shared." The bread landed in the sand between them. The dog sniffed the air but didn't move forward. Instead, it looked at him again, long, steady, almost human, and then sat down. Earl frowned. "You're not gonna eat?" The animal tilted its head slightly as if to say no. "Well, suit yourself." He turned away, pretending not to care, but that stare lingered in his mind longer than it should have. Night came fast in the desert. The temperature dropped like a stone, and stars flooded the sky, cold and sharp. Earl lay in the truck bed, under an old tarp, trying to sleep. But the image of that dog stayed behind his eyelids. Around midnight, he heard soft footsteps. He tensed, ready to grab the wrench, but then came a low whine. The dog had come closer, curling itself into a ball beside the truck tire. It didn't ask permission. It didn't need to. Something about that quiet companionship felt like an old memory sneaking back when he wasn't looking. He watched it through the cracked window for a long time, before finally closing his eyes. In the morning, the dog was gone. Just paw prints circling the truck and a faint trail leading toward the dry wash. Figures, Earl muttered, climbing out to stretch his aching back. He reached for the bread he'd tossed yesterday. It was gone too. "Guess you ate after all?" He smiled faintly, though he didn't know why. Then, as he turned to climb back into the cab, something caught his eye, near the rear tire, a glint of metal half buried in sand. He crouched, brushed the dirt away, and found an old tin can rusted through edges sharp. He pried it open, expecting trash. Inside was a dull silver badge. He froze. It was a U.S. Marine insignia, the same kind he'd worn 2 decades ago before everything went to hell. He hadn't seen one since. His chest tightened. He looked around, scanning the horizon for the dog. Nothing but wind and distance. He knelt there for a while, badge in hand, the morning light catching on the metal like it was alive again. "Where'd you find this boy?" He murmured to no one. The badge was old pitted, but the engraving was still there. Jennings, CCO, 3rd Recon. His name, his unit. He hadn't lost it. He'd thrown it away. The realization hit him like a slow, steady punch. The past had found its way back. He turned toward the open desert, half expecting the shepherd to reappear, but only the wind answered. He slipped the badge into his pocket and sat on the tailgate, staring at nothing. The sun climbed higher, burning the horizon white. Damn dog, he muttered. But he couldn't shake the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he was the one who'd been found. The next morning came hard and bright, like the sun was punishing the land just for existing. Earl sat behind the wheel of the truck, chewing on the same toothpick, staring out at the endless horizon. He hadn't slept much. That badge kept burning in his pocket all night, heavy like a secret he didn't ask for. He told himself it was just coincidence, a piece of junk blown there by the wind. But the desert didn't do coincidences. It buried things, and sometimes it spit them back out when you least wanted them. He turned the key. The old Ford coughed, rattled, and died again. Figures, he muttered. He popped the hood, got out, and the first thing he saw made him freeze. The dog was back, standing by the front bumper, dust clinging to its fur, those same eyes watching him, calm, unblinking, patient. "You again," Earl said. The dog didn't flinch. "You get lost or you just got bad taste in company." He threw a hand toward the open desert. "Go on, get. Nothing here but bad memories." The dog just tilted its head, then sat down, tail sweeping the dirt once, twice. "Damn stubborn mutt," he growled, slamming the hood shut. He climbed into the cab, slammed the door, started the truck again. The engine groaned like it wanted to give up, but somehow caught. Earl pressed the gas. The truck rolled forward about 3 feet before a low growl made him stop. The shepherd had moved behind the truck, barking sharp and insistent, blocking the way. "You're kidding me." He threw it into park, stepped out, and pointed down the road. "Move. You're going to get yourself killed." But the dog didn't move. It ran to the back of the truck again, barking harder this time, claws scraping the dirt. Then it started digging. Earl frowned, shielding his eyes from the glare. "What the hell are you doing?" The dog's paws kicked up dust fast, desperate, like it was racing against something only it could hear. Earl sighed, frustration bubbling up. "Fine, you dig. I'm leaving." He turned to climb back into the truck, but then he heard a sound, a sharp metallic clink beneath the sand. The dog froze, nose pressed to the ground. Earl hesitated. He walked over, crouched beside it, brushing away the loose dirt. Something glinted beneath the surface, a small, circular object buried deep. He reached in and pulled it free. His breath caught. It was another medal. Not just any medal. His medal. The Bronze Star he'd earned 20 years ago for saving 3 men in Afghanistan, the one he'd thrown into the dirt the day he came home. He had told himself he didn't deserve it, that it belonged to someone braver, someone who didn't survive when others didn't. But here it was tarnished, scarred, still carrying his name on the back. Capt Earl Jennings. He felt the air leave his chest. For a long moment the world went quiet, just the faint rattle of the wind and the dog's soft panting beside him. How? He stopped himself, staring at the sand-stained ribbon hanging limp from the metal. His hands shook as he turned it over, thumb tracing the engraving. 20 years buried, forgotten, waiting right where he'd left it. The shepherd sat close now, eyes locked on him, chest rising slow and steady. Earl swallowed hard, a muscle in his jaw twitching. "You don't even know what that is, do you?" he whispered. The dog tilted its head again, a faint whimper in its throat. "You found something that was supposed to stay lost," he said, half to the dog, half to the wind. The heat pressed down heavily, and suddenly the air felt too thin. He crouched, lower elbows on his knees, metal dangling between his fingers. The metal was hot against his skin, but he didn't let go. "I threw this away," he said, voice cracking slightly. "Right here. Right. Here." He looked at the ground beneath them. He remembered the night. The bottle, the rain, the anger, the guilt. He'd stood right in this spot, drunk out of his mind, shouting at the sky, while thunder rolled over the desert, and then he'd hurled that medal as far as he could. He hadn't come back to this stretch of land since, and now a starving stray had led him straight to it. He looked at the dog again. Its ears were half-back eyes, soft, waiting. No judgment, no fear, just waiting. He reached out, hesitated, then let his hand fall on its head. The fur was coarse, warm, alive. "Guess we're both a couple of lost things," he muttered. The shepherd leaned into his touch for just a second before pulling back, turning toward the open desert. It barked once, short and sharp like a signal. Then it looked back at him, tail low, eyes steady. Earl followed its gaze towards the barren ridge where the wind carved little ghosts in the sand. For the first time in years, something inside him stirred not quite hope, not forgiveness, but the faint ache of something waking up. He closed his fist around the metal and stood. "All right, Scout," he said quietly, testing the name on his tongue. "Lead the way." The dog took a few steps, paused, looked back again, waiting for him to follow. Earl stared at the horizon, the endless heat, the place where the past refused to stay buried, and for reasons he couldn't explain, he started walking. The metal burned in his hand, the sun burned on his neck, and somewhere deep inside a door he'd nailed shut began to tremble. That night the desert was so still it almost hummed. The air had cooled to a knife edge, thin and brittle, carrying the faint scent of dust and oil. Earl sat beside the truck, metal in hand, turning it under the pale wash of moonlight. Scout lay a few feet away, breathing slow, chest rising and falling in rhythm with the silence. The dog hadn't left his side since digging up the metal, as if it knew something Earl didn't want to remember. The old Marine lit a cigarette, the glow trembling between his fingers. He stared out across the sand and tried not to think, but memories were like landmines. You never saw them coming until you were already bleeding. Somewhere between the first drag and the last ash, his eyelids grew heavy, the line between dream and memory fading. He was back in the desert, but not this one. The air smelled of gunpowder and heat, the kind of heat that made your bones ache. The ground wasn't sand, it was grit and blood. He could hear shouting in the distance, muffled by the ringing in his ears. The sky was burning red, and smoke rose in pillars. He turned disoriented, his rifle slick in his hands. "Reyes," he shouted. No answer. Then a shape emerged from the haze, a young man, maybe 20, lean, dark hair matted with sweat. Private Miguel Reyes, his radio man. The kid had barely been out of high school when they were deployed. Reyes was smiling that same crooked grin he always wore even in hell. "Cap, they're flanking from the ridge," he yelled, pointing toward the horizon. Behind him a German shepherd barked low and fierce, body tense, eyes bright. Valor, that was the dog's name. Reyes had found him as a pup during a sweep through an abandoned compound. Said the dog reminded him of home, of the one his dad kept on their farm. Earl remembered laughing about it, then telling the kid to keep the mutt out of the crossfire. But Valor had saved them more than once, sniffing out traps, finding the wounded. That day, though, nothing could save them. The explosion came from nowhere, a flash of white light and pressure that lifted the world off its axis. Earl hit the ground, hard ears ringing, face buried in dust. When he lifted his head, everything was on fire. Reyes was gone. Smoke screams the sharp smell of burnt metal. Then through the blur he saw movement, Reyes crawling toward him, blood spreading across his chest, Valor dragging him by the vest strap, teeth clenched tight. Earl tried to move, but his leg was pinned under debris. "Reyes," he shouted, his voice breaking. The kid's eyes met his bright, terrified human. He pushed Valor away with a weak hand. "Get the captain," he gasped, but the dog didn't leave him. The next shell hit close, shaking the ground. Earl crawled, dragging himself forward, and then silence. Just the wind. Just the desert. He reached them too late. Reyes wasn't breathing. Valor lay beside him, chest rising shallow, one leg twisted blood dark against the sand. The dog's eyes found Earl's for a single moment, then closed. The dream shifted. The sound of Rotor's medics shouting the metallic smell of blood. Earl screaming, "He saved me, they saved me," then darkness. Earl woke with a start, heart hammering like gunfire in his chest. The cigarette had burned to ash between his fingers. Sweat dampened his temples despite the chill. The night was quiet again, but his ears still rang with echoes from a war that wouldn't end. Scout was sitting up now, watching him. The dog's silhouette was outlined by the moonlight, head tilted, ears pricked forward. Earl blinked hard, trying to steady his breathing. Just a dream, he muttered. Just a damn dream. But when he looked down at Scout, something froze him mid-thought. On the dog's left hind leg, just above the paw, was a scar. A rough, pale streak of healed flesh that caught the light like a whisper. He'd seen that shape before, a crescent slash like a hook. The same place Valor had been hit that day in the desert. Earl's throat tightened. He leaned closer, his hand hovering before finally brushing against the scar. Scout didn't pull away. He just looked at Earl, steady, calm, as if asking what took him so long to notice. Earl drew back, pulse racing. "No," he whispered, shaking his head. "That's not possible." He stared at the dog, searching for reason logic, anything that could explain the sudden ache spreading through his chest. It wasn't the same dog. Couldn't be. But the scar was there, a ghost written in flesh. He swallowed hard, staring at the metal glinting beside him on the truck bed. The desert around him felt too quiet, too watchful, like it was waiting for him to admit something he wasn't ready to say. Scout yawned softly, then rested his head on his paws, eyes still open, still watching him. Earl rubbed his temples, a dull pain pulsing behind his eyes. "You're just another stray," he told the dog, voice low. "Another damn shadow that won't stay buried." But even as he said it, his hand trembled. He reached for the canteen, took a sip of warm water, and stared out at the horizon where the sand shimmered silver under the moon. The past was alive out here, restless and unfinished. And no matter how far he drove, it seemed to follow like a set of tracks he could never outrun. He looked back at Scout, sleeping now, the scar still catching the light, and for the first time he wondered if the dog had really found him, or if something much older had been waiting in the sand all along. The morning came without color. The sky was pale, washed-out gray, and the wind carried the sharp scent of dry earth. Earl woke with a jolt, his hand still resting near the dog, the images from his dream clinging to his mind like smoke. He sat up slowly, rubbing his eyes, staring at the horizon, where the sun was just beginning to climb. Scout stretched beside him, yawned, then looked up at him as if to ask whether the ghosts were gone. "You sleep better than I do," Earl muttered, pushing himself to his feet. His bones creaked with the stiffness of years spent carrying too much weight. He reached into his pocket and felt the cold metal of the medal again. That damn thing had been following him since yesterday, whispering reminders he didn't want. He pulled it out and turned it over in his hand. It was scratched and tarnished, but something about the way it caught the light made his chest tighten. He walked to the back of the truck where the dirt had been disturbed where Scout had dug the day before. The sand was scattered uneven like a wound half closed. He knelt down, pressing his palm against it. "You dragged me back here for a reason, didn't you?" he said quietly. Scout wagged his tail once, but stayed silent. Earl sighed, pushing his fingers deeper into the sand. He wasn't sure what he was looking for, closure maybe, or proof that the past was still buried where he left it. His nails scraped something solid beneath the surface. He froze. "Well, I'll be damned," he whispered, digging faster. The sand fell away to reveal a small tin box, the metal dull with rust corners eaten by time. His breath caught. He recognized it. It had been his mother's. He'd kept it in his duffel bag when he enlisted a little keepsake she gave him the night before he left for boot camp. He thought he'd lost it during deployment, or maybe he'd buried it himself when he came back, trying to erase every trace of what he'd become. But here it was waiting. The lid creaked when he pried it open. Inside, wrapped in a yellowed handkerchief, was a folded envelope, edges brittle with age. His name was written across the front in handwriting, so familiar it made his throat close. "To my son Earl." He stared at it for a long moment, afraid to breathe. Scout came closer, sitting beside him, watching in quiet curiosity. Earl's fingers trembled as he slid the letter free. The paper was dry, fragile. The ink faded to brown. He hesitated before unfolding it, afraid it might turn to dust in his hands. But it didn't. His mother's words waited patiently, neat and careful, each line written with love that hadn't known despair yet. He began to read. "My dear boy, it started if you're reading this. It means you came home. I hope you did. I've prayed for that every day since you left. I know you carry strength in your body and fire in your heart, but I worry about what war does to both." His eyes blurred, but he kept reading. "You've always wanted to be the one who saves everyone. That's what makes you my son. But listen to me now, Earl. Not everyone can be saved, and that doesn't make you less of a man. If one day you find that you can't feel anything anymore, if the world goes quiet inside you, don't run from it. Don't drink it away. Don't hide from what's left of your heart. Instead, find someone or something to save. Because when you save a life, you find your own again." His hand shook as he reached the last line, the ink smudged where her pen must have lingered. "You don't need to be a hero, son. You just need to remember how to love." Earl's vision wavered. He closed his eyes, pressing the letter against his forehead, feeling its weight, its warmth, its mercy. For a long time he couldn't move. The silence of the desert surrounded him, vast and tender. Scout pressed his nose to Earl's arm, a soft sound escaping his throat. Earl looked down, eyes red, voice hoarse. "She wrote this before I left. She must have mailed it after I shipped out. I never got it." He laughed, but it broke in the middle, sharp and small. "Guess it waited for me." The dog nuzzled closer, tail brushing the sand. Earl exhaled long and slow, the kind of breath that feels like it's pulling something out of your chest. He folded the letter back up carefully, tucking it into his shirt pocket like something holy. The metal still lay in the dirt beside the open box, the two glinting faintly together, duty and love side by side, both buried, both found. He sat there for a long while, watching the wind move across the ground, carrying small swirls of dust that danced and vanished. It felt almost like the desert itself was breathing with him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel completely hollow, just heavy with memory, with loss, with something dangerously close to hope. He reached out and placed a hand on Scout's head. "You knew, didn't you?" he whispered. The dog blinked slow and calm, as if to say it didn't matter how he'd found it, only that he finally had. Earl glanced once more at the letter, then at the horizon where the sky was starting to turn gold. Somewhere far off, the faint sound of a train echoed through the still air. The world was moving again, even if just an inch. He got to his feet, brushing sand from his jeans metal clenched tight in his fist. The wind picked up, tugging at his shirt, carrying the faint smell of rain from miles away. Scout barked once, sharp, clear, and Earl turned toward the sound, his heart still echoing with the words that refused to fade. "Find someone to save, and you'll find yourself." By the time the sun reached its peak, the desert had turned into a furnace. The horizon shimmered like molten glass, the heat warping the air, until the world itself seemed unsteady. Earl had been driving for hours, following a cracked service road that led to nowhere in particular, his eyes squinting through the glare. Scout sat in the passenger seat, head out the window, tongue lolling, catching what little breeze the world still offered. The old truck rattled like a dying lung, and every few miles Earl tapped the fuel gauge, pretending it might change its mind. "Don't look at me like that," he muttered, glancing at Scout. "I told you this was a bad idea." The dog just blinked, unimpressed, then rested its head on the dashboard. Earl sighed, rubbing his temples. The letter was folded in his shirt pocket, the words of his mother still fresh in his head. "Find someone to save, and you'll find yourself." He hadn't planned to do anything noble. He didn't even know if he could. But the thought had planted itself somewhere deep inside him, a quiet pulse that refused to die. When the first gust of wind hit, it came gentle, just a whisper brushing across the windshield. Then another followed stronger, carrying dust that hissed against the glass. Earl slowed, frowning. That's not good. He glanced toward the west. The sky there was bruising, dark yellow, turning to brown, a wall of dust rolling toward them like a living thing. Hell, he breathed. Scout sat up, ears perked, muscles tight. The truck shuddered as the wind slammed into it, a low moan rising from the shifting dunes. Within minutes, the world disappeared. Sand roared across the desert, blotting out the sun. The windshield turned opaque, a solid wall of dust and grit. Earl could barely see the hood of the truck. He pulled to a stop, heart thudding. "We'll ride it out," he said mostly to himself. The wind screamed louder, shaking the doors, clawing at every seam. Scout barked once, sharp, uneasy. "Stay down, boy," Earl said, reaching to shut the window tighter. But before he could, the truck jolted violently, one of the rear tires sinking into a patch of soft sand. The old Ford groaned, tilted, then lurched sideways. No, damn it." Earl slammed his shoulder against the door, but the storm drowned out everything. The world was sound and motion and dust. The truck tilted again, harder this time, and he was thrown against the steering wheel. Scout barked wildly, claws scraping the seat. Then came the crash. The truck rolled once, maybe twice, he couldn't tell. When it stopped, the air was full of grit, the sky gone. Earl coughed hard, spitting sand blood salty in his mouth. He tried to move, but his leg throbbed with pain, pinned under the door frame. "Scout," he shouted, voice raw. No answer. "Scout?" The only reply was the wind howling like something alive. He pushed, strained, but the metal wouldn't budge. Panic clawed at his throat. "Come on, damn it, move." He slammed his fist against the dashboard, the pain sharp and grounding. Somewhere in the storm, a faint bark echoed distant, muffled. "Scout," he shouted again. Then nothing. Minutes passed, or maybe hours. Time had no shape here. His vision blurred, his mouth dry as paper. He reached for the glove box, found his canteen, and shook it. Empty. He leaned his head back, every breath a scrape. Maybe this was how it was supposed to end, buried where no one would find him, the desert taking back what it had spared once before. He laughed, bitter and weak. "Guess you win, old man," he muttered, thinking of Reyes, of valor, of every name carved into the walls of his memory. The wind shifted suddenly. He squinted toward the noise, a faint shape moving through the blur of sand. At first he thought he was hallucinating, but then he heard it. Barking. Closer now. His heart lurched. Scout. The shape emerged from the haze, low to the ground, fighting the storm, dragging something heavy behind it. Earl blinked through the grit, disbelief cutting through exhaustion. Scout staggered toward him, teeth clamped around the handle of a dented jerry can half full of water. The dog's fur was matted with dust. Eyes nearly closed from the wind, but it kept moving step after step, until it reached the overturned truck. Earl's chest tightened. "Jesus, boy." Scout dropped the can beside the door, panting hard. Water sloshed inside, catching the light like a small miracle. Earl reached out, gripping the handle, unscrewed the cap with shaken hands, and drank. The water was warm, metallic, but it was life. He pressed his forehead against the rim, tears mixing with sweat and dust. You found this," he whispered. Scout didn't answer. The dog just stood there, swaying, tail barely moving. Earl reached through the broken window, his hand trembling as he brushed the dog's muzzle. "You came back for me," he said, voice breaking. "You stupid brave thing, you came back." The dog gave a weak whine, then collapsed beside the door body, heaving with exhaustion. The jerrycan tipped water, spilling into the sand, soaking the dust dark. Earl froze, watching the little puddle sink away, precious and fleeting. No, hey." He leaned down, fingers brushing Scout's fur. The dog's eyes fluttered open, finding his. Earl's voice cracked. "You saved me, you damn fool. You saved me again?" Scout's breathing slowed, chest rising shallowly, sand caked in the corners of his mouth. Earl cradled the dog's head in his lap, thumb tracing the scar on its leg. The wind howled outside, tearing at the world. But inside that wrecked truck, there was only quiet. "Why don't you ever know how to be afraid?" he whispered. The question hung there, unanswered, as the storm raged on, and the man and the dog clung to the thin, trembling line between life and loss. The storm broke by dawn. When the wind finally died, the world was quiet again, draped in a pale haze of dust. The desert looked softer somehow, like it had been washed clean, though nothing was ever really clean out here. Earl sat by the overturned truck, his back against the wheel, while one hand resting on Scout's side. The dog slept, breath faint, but steady fur clumped with sand. Earl's body ached, his throat raw, his mind scraping against itself like old metal. He didn't know how long he sat there before he finally whispered, "You did good, boy." The sun climbed higher, burning away the chill. Earl took the jerry can half empty now and poured a little into his palm, letting Scout lap it weakly. "That's all we've got left," he said, voice hoarse. "But we'll make it count." A day later, they reached the edge of town, a collection of gas stations, shuttered stores, and a diner that smelled faintly of grease and coffee. The truck was useless now, its axle bent its engine, coughing like a dying smoker, so Earl parked it behind the auto shop and walked the rest of the way. Scout trotted beside him, limping slightly, but refusing to fall behind. Earl's clothes were caked with dust, his beard thicker than ever, his face weathered and red from the sun. He looked like a man who belonged nowhere, and the town treated him that way, glances that slid past doors that closed a little too fast. He didn't blame them. Ghosts weren't meant to make people comfortable. He pushed open the door to a small pawn shop on Main Street. The bell above the frame gave a dull jingle. Inside it smelled of old metal and dust, the shelves crowded with clocks that didn't tick rifles that hadn't been fired in years, and glass cases of jewelry that had outlived their owners. Behind the counter stood a thin man in his late 60s hair, white as paper, wearing a faded Marine Corps cap. He looked up, squinting. "Help you?" Earl nodded, reaching into his pocket. He set the metal on the counter, the bronze star dull under the fluorescent light. "I need to sell it," he said quietly. The old man frowned, picked it up, turning it over in his wrinkled hands. "Where'd you get this was mine?" Earl said. "Doesn't do me much good anymore." The man's eyes narrowed. "Your name, Earl Jennings." The silence that followed was long enough for the hum of the air conditioner to become unbearable. The man's gaze lingered on the inscription, his fingers tracing the letters like they were sacred. "Jennings," he said finally, his voice lower now. "3rd Recon, Charlie Company." Earl's jaw tightened. "Yeah." The man looked up. His eyes had changed wider wet at the edges. "My son was in that unit." Earl froze. "Your son?" The old man nodded slowly. "Corporal Daniel Porter. He didn't make it home." Earl felt something shift in his chest, a slow, heavy ache that started in the gut and rose to the throat. "Porter?" He repeated the name, tasting like sand. "Yeah, I remember him. Good soldier, quiet, always carried that damn harmonica." The man smiled faintly, a memory flickering behind his eyes. "That was Danny. Always said he'd play it for his mom when he got back." He set the metal down carefully, almost reverently. "You fought with him?" "Yeah," Earl said softly. "He saved my life once." The man looked at him for a long moment, then reached under the counter and pulled out a framed photo. The glass was cracked, the colors faded, but the image was unmistakable. A group of young Marines standing in the desert, grinning arms slung around each other. Earl was there, 20 pounds lighter, sunburned and laughing like he didn't know what pain was yet. Beside him stood Daniel Porter, the harmonica in his hand, and at their feet a German shepherd tongue lolling tail high. Earl's breath caught. "That's valor," he whispered. The man nodded. "Danny's dog. He brought him back from a recon base near Kandahar. Said that dog was smarter than half his squad." Earl stared at the photograph, his fingers brushing the edge of the glass. "He was," he said quietly. "Saved us all more times than I can count." He looked down at Scout, who was lying near the counter, watching them both. The resemblance hit him like a soup punch to the gut, the same stance, same markings, even the same intelligent eyes that seemed to see straight through you. Earl knelt beside him, his throat tight. "You look just like him," he whispered, "damn near his shadow." The old man leaned over the counter, squinting at the dog. "You know," he said after a moment, "when Valor died, Danny made sure his line was kept alive. He had the pup sent home before his last tour. My brother's boy, he took one of the litter. Raised him. Been in the family ever since." Earl looked up sharply. You're saying the man smiled softly. That one there, he's got the same blood. Maybe even the same fire. Earl swallowed hard, unable to find words. The world seemed to narrow the dusty shop, the photo. The metal between them, the dog at his side. Threads of time crossing in silence. It wasn't fate, not exactly. Just the stubborn way love sometimes refuses to die. The old man reached across the counter and placed a hand on the metal. Keep it, he said. You earned it and so did he. My boy would want it that way. Earl shook his head. I can't. You can, the man said gently. You came all this way for a reason. Earl stared down at the metal, the weight of it suddenly unbearable. Scout pressed against his leg tail, brushing his boot, a quiet reminder that some debts can't be repaid, they can only be carried. Outside, the sun hit the window, turning the cracked glass gold. Earl blinked against the light, his voice barely a whisper. Seems like your boy and mine had the same kind of heart. The old man smiled through a shimmer of tears. Yeah, he said. And they found each other again, didn't they? Earl looked down at Scout at the scar, the sand-colored fur, the calm eyes that held more history than a dog should. He reached out and stroked the back of its neck, the gesture simple but trembling. Yeah, he said softly. Looks like they did. The bell over the pawn shop door gave a tired little ring as the morning wind slipped through, carrying the smell of sun-baked asphalt and faint rain that would never fall. Earl still stood at the counter, his hand hovering over the bronze star. The metal warm now under the strip of sunlight cutting through the dusty window. Mr. Porter, the old shop owner, hadn't said anything for a long while. He just stared at the metal, as if it could speak, as if all the things left unsaid between father and son might be buried somewhere inside its tarnished surface. The air between them was thick, not awkward, but sacred in its silence. Scout lay near Earl's boots, chin resting on the floorboards, tail twitching every so often, as if sensing the tension pulsing between the two men. Finally, Mr. Porter exhaled a soul-shaking breath that carried 20 years of unfinished grief. You know, he said quietly, his voice rasping like paper. I think I've seen that medal before. Earl looked up, wary. It's the one they gave me after Kandahar, he said. Bronze Star for pulling 2 men out after the explosion. Porter nodded faintly, eyes still on the medal. That explosion took my boy. His words landed soft but sharp. Earl felt something twist deep in his chest. I know, he said quietly. I was there. Porter nodded again, as if confirming something only the years could make true. Before that last deployment, Danny came home on leave, the old man continued. He told me he'd made peace with a lot of things, but there was one he couldn't. He said he had a medal he didn't think he deserved. Said a man in his squad, his captain, should have been the one to get it. Earl's throat tightened. He said that Porter gave a small, sad smile. Said he was going to give it to that man if he ever saw him again. Said he's the reason I'm still breathing Pop. If I don't come back, make sure he keeps it. He looked up at Earl, then his eyes glimmering through the dust and the ache. That was you, wasn't it? Earl didn't answer. He didn't need to. The silence told the truth for him. Porter's hand trembled slightly as he picked up the medal, turning it over once more. Guess he got his wish, he murmured. He gave it to you. Maybe not with his hands, but... His voice cracked the last word, breaking apart before it could form. Earl looked away, jaw tight, staring at a spot on the floor where sunlight pooled like gold. I buried it, he said after a moment, his voice hoarse. Couldn't stand to look at it. I thought if I got rid of it, maybe the guilt would go with it. He let out a humorless laugh. Guess I was wrong. Mr. Porter didn't move. He just nodded slowly, his gaze softening, not with pity, but with something closer to understanding. Guilt's heavy, he said, but mercy's heavier. You carry it long enough it either breaks you, or it teaches you to bend. The words sank deep, quiet, and steady, the kind of truth that didn't ask for an answer. Earl swallowed hard, the muscles in his throat working against the weight pressing there. Your boy saved my life, he said finally. I should have died in that blast. He pushed me down, took it instead. Porter gave a small, tired smile. Then maybe this was how it was meant to be. Maybe you kept his metal safe all this time without even knowing. Earl blinked, his vision blurring. He reached out and slid the metal back across the counter. Then it's yours, he said. I can't keep what belongs to your son. But Porter pushed it gently back toward him. You can, he said softly, because he wanted you to. Because you're still here, and he isn't. That's not a punishment, son. That's a trust. The word son hit Earl like a blow he didn't see coming. He opened his mouth to speak, but nothing came out. For a long time, the two men just stood there. One who had lost a son, the other who had lost himself. Scout shifted restlessly, sensing the current running between them. Outside, the wind picked up again, whistling through the cracked sign above the door. Earl finally cleared his throat. I should go, he said quietly. He gathered his worn jacket from the chair, tucking the metal back into his pocket, like something fragile he didn't deserve to touch. Porter nodded, but didn't hide his sadness. Take care of that dog, he said. He's carrying more history than most men could handle. Earl gave a faint, weary smile. Yeah, he murmured. I'm starting to believe that. He turned toward the door, pushing it open, the bell above giving a hollow ring. The sunlight outside was blinding the street empty except for the low hum of distant traffic. He stepped out, letting the door swing shut behind him, but before he could take another step, Scout barked sharply. Earl looked down. The dog stood firm, tail low, teeth, gently gripping the cuff of his jacket, tugging backward. Hey, what are you doing? Earl asked, but Scout barked again, harder this time, pulling as if to anchor him. The sound wasn't angry, it was desperate. The same bark the dog had used in the storm when Earl had tried to give up. Earl stopped staring at the shepherd's eyes, steady, pleading alive with something unspoken. You think I'm running again, don't you? He whispered. Scout didn't move. His grip didn't loosen. Earl sighed, the corner of his mouth trembling. Yeah, he said softly. You're probably right. He sank down on one knee, his hand sliding over the dog's neck, feeling the slow, solid thump of its heartbeat beneath his palm. You always know when I'm about to do something stupid. Scout released his jacket tail, flicking once, then leaned its head against his chest. Earl let out a breath he didn't know he'd been holding. The metal in his pocket felt heavier now, not as guilt, but as a promise. Somewhere behind him through the pawn shop window, Mr. Porter stood watching, hand pressed to the glass, his expression caught somewhere between pride and peace. Earl looked up, nodded once, then turned toward the open road. Scout pressed close to his side, as if daring him to keep walking forward this time instead of away. The road out of town stretched endlessly, a ribbon of cracked asphalt vanishing into the red horizon. Earl drove with the windows down, the dry wind clawing at his hair, and the desert sun pressing on the back of his neck, like judgment. Scout sat in the passenger seat again, watching the endless nothing ahead of them, his ears twitching at every rattle of the old Ford. The metal hung from the rearview mirror, swinging gently with the movement of the truck, catching glints of light that flashed across Earl's face like ghosts. He didn't know exactly where he was going, only that he had to go back. To the place where it had all ended once before. To the stretch of sand where men became memories. You sure about this, boy? He asked quietly, eyes fixed on the horizon. Scout gave a low whine, the kind that wasn't fear, but agreement. Earl nodded, jaw set. Yeah, me too. He gripped the steering wheel tighter. Every mile brought the memories closer. The gunfire, the smoke, the dust that stuck to sweat and blood. It had been 20 years, but the land didn't forget. No one ever really did. By mid-afternoon, the truck began to cough, its engine stuttering in protest. Earl tapped the gas, but the sound only grew worse, like an old man's lungs giving out. Don't you start this now, he muttered, slapping the dashboard. The Ford lurched once, twice, then sputtered and died, rolling to a stop on the shoulder of a dirt road that looked identical to every other mile behind them. He turned the key again. Nothing but silence. You've got to be kidding me, he said, kicking the door open and stepping out into the shimmering heat. The air was thick with the smell of oil and dust. He popped the hood, stared at the engine like it might apologize. It didn't. "Well, looks like we're walking," he muttered. Scout jumped down beside him, tail low, scanning the horizon. The desert was still, except for a low wind whispering over the dunes. Earl looked around, then froze. Something about this place felt wrong. Too quiet, too familiar. His chest tightened as the realization crept in. The ridgeline ahead, the dry wash curving west, the cluster of half-buried rocks. It was the same landscape he'd seen 20 years ago through smoke and fire. This was where it happened, where Reyes fell, where the world had ended once already. Earl's legs felt weak. He dropped to a knee, hands pressing into the sand as if to steady himself against the weight of it. "Jesus," he whispered. Scout circled him once, sensing the shift, then stopped a few yards away, nose to the ground. The shepherd began to dig paws, moving with purpose the way they had the day he found the medal. Earl watched, frozen. "What are you doing now, huh?" he asked softly, but his voice shook. The dog kept digging sand, flying behind him, the rhythm sharp and frantic. Earl walked closer, the sun blazing in his eyes, heart thudding. "Hey, easy," he said, crouching beside him. "You'll tear your paws up again." But Scout didn't stop until his claws scraped something solid beneath the surface, a dull thud of metal or wood. Earl's pulse quickened. He brushed the sand away with trembling hands until he uncovered a weathered wooden rod, smooth and pale beneath the dust. A military command baton. He recognized it instantly. His fingers closed around it and the weight hit him like a blow. He hadn't seen it since that night, the night everything burned. He dropped it while dragging Reyes toward cover right before the explosion. His name had been carved into it once by one of his men as a joke. He wiped away the sand and his heart stopped. The words were still there, though faded and worn. "For Earl, you'll lead us home." His throat closed. The desert tilted. He sank back on his heels, the baton clutched to his chest. "They made this for me," he whispered. "God, I forgot." His voice broke the memories, spilling through Reyes, laughing Porter tuning his harmonica. The smell of gun oil and sweat, the sound of young men pretending they weren't afraid. He looked down at the sand beneath him, at the place where their blood had once soaked into the earth. And suddenly, it didn't feel like a grave anymore. It felt like they'd left something waiting for him, something they knew he'd need when he finally came back. Scout nudged his arm gently, then sat beside him, tail brushing the sand. Earl laughed through a sob. "You keep finding the pieces I'm trying to bury," he said. He turned the baton in his hand again, tracing the carved letters with his thumb. The words felt like a heartbeat beneath his skin. "You'll lead us home." "They still believed in me," he said quietly, half to himself, "even after I stopped believing in anything." The wind picked up, curling through the dunes, carrying with it the faint smell of rain. Earl looked toward the horizon, where storm clouds gathered over the far ridge, turning the light, copper and dim. He stood slowly, shoulders squared, the baton in one hand, the metal glinting faintly from his pocket. Scout rose 2 ears, alert eyes on the same horizon. "Guess we're not done yet." Earl said, his voice steadier now. He looked down at the shepherd. "You hear that, boy? Time to bring them home?" Scout barked once, clear and sure, the sound echoing across the emptiness. Earl looked out over the desert one last time. The place where guilt had buried him, where mercy had found him again, and for the first time in decades he felt like he knew which way to walk. The road behind was gone, the path ahead uncertain, but the baton in his hand was light like a compass that pointed not north but toward redemption itself. He took a step forward, the dog close at his heel, both of them silhouettes against the dying light, moving toward something neither could name, but both could finally face. The road back to Lovelock was longer than Earl remembered. The asphalt gave way to gravel then, to packed dirt that cracked under the tires of the truck he'd borrowed from a mechanic back in town. The desert had followed him all the way, dust still clung to his boots, to his hair, to the lines around his eyes that the years had carved like dry riverbeds. Scout sat in the passenger seat, head out the window, the wind flattening his ears. The dog had healed from the storm, though the limp in his right leg never fully left. Earl glanced at him every so often, as if making sure he was real. "Almost there," he said softly, though he wasn't sure who he was reassuring, the dog or himself. The highway turned, bending toward the hills where Nevada softened into scrubland and forgotten farms. The closer he got, the quieter it felt. The kind of silence that doesn't just come from the land, but from the years that have passed through it. When the first mailbox appeared, a dented metal box leaning at an angle, Earl felt his chest tighten. He knew this stretch of road. Every mile was a ghost. The fields were gone now, overrun with weeds and brittle stalks, but he could still see it, the outline of the house that once stood proud and sunlit. His mother's voice calling from the porch, the smell of laundry drying in the wind. The truck slowed to a crawl. He stopped where the dirt path used to split toward the old property. What remained was almost nothing. A few boards jutting from the earth, a scatter of brick, the ghost of a porch swallowed by sagebrush. But when he stepped out, it was as if the air changed, thicker, somehow full of memory. Scout jumped down beside him, sniffing the ground, tail low. Earl stood still for a long time, his shadow stretching across the ruin of his childhood. "This was it," he murmured. "Right here." The sound of footsteps behind him made him turn. From across the road came an old woman, small, bent with age, her white hair pulled into a loose bun. She leaned on a cane, her face creased like parchment, but her eyes were sharp with recognition. "Earl Jennings," she said, her voice trembling just enough to make it tender. Earl blinked, almost not believing it. "Mrs. Holloway." The woman smiled, slow and sad. "Well, I'll be damned. I thought you'd gone for good." Earl tried to smile back, but it came out crooked. "Maybe I did," he said. "Didn't mean to stay gone this long." She looked him up and down, her gaze lingering on his worn jacket, the dirt under his nails, the way he carried his shoulders like a man used to wait. "You look like your father," she said softly. "But your mother, she was waiting for you till the end." The words caught him off guard. "She's—" Mrs. Holloway nodded. 5 years now. Peaceful, thank God. She talked about you all the time. Said she knew you'd come home one day." Earl's throat tightened. He looked down at the ground, his boot tracing a half-buried step. "I should have come sooner," he whispered. She'd have understood, the woman said gently. She reached into the pocket of her cardigan and pulled out a small envelope yellowed with time. "She left this with me," she said. "Said I was to give it to you if you ever showed up. I didn't think I'd live to see the day." Earl took it with trembling hands. Inside was a photograph, him maybe 6 years old, sitting on the porch steps, barefoot, smiling into the sunlight. His mother was standing in the doorway behind him, her hand resting on his shoulder. Written in her handwriting across the bottom of the photo were the words, "My boy will come home when his heart remembers how to love." Earl stared at the photo until his vision blurred. His thumb brushed the faded ink. "She always knew," he murmured. "Before I did." Mrs. Holloway smiled faintly. Mothers usually do. The wind picked up, rustling the sage and carrying the scent of dust and lilac, the same smell that used to cling to his mother's dresses. Earl looked around, the weight of years pressing down on him. The house was gone, but the memory wasn't. It was in the earth, in the air, in every nail and shadow. Scout wandered toward what used to be the front porch, nose to the ground. He stopped by a splintered doorframe, half buried in dirt, then sat head tilted. Earl walked over, heart aching in his chest. The shepherd sniffed the air once, then slowly lay down, resting his head against the old threshold where his mother once stood waiting for him. The sight broke something inside him. It was such a simple thing, just a dog lying in the doorway of a house that no longer existed. But in that moment, Earl saw it, all the years he'd lost, the forgiveness he'd run from, the love he'd thought was buried under sand and guilt. He knelt beside Scout, his hand trembling as it brushed the dog's fur. "You feel it too, don't you?" he whispered. The dog didn't move, just sighed softly, eyes half closed, as if listening to something only he could hear. Earl stared at the spot where his mother's shadow might have once fallen. Sunlight cutting through the empty frame like a memory refusing to fade. The photograph fluttered in his other hand, the edges catching the wind. He pressed it gently against the doorframe, pinning it there with a small stone. "I'm home, Ma," he said quietly. "Took me a while, but I made it." The air grew still again. Even the wind seemed to pause as if honoring the words. Scout stirred, shifting slightly, then placed one paw across the threshold, his eyes on the fading horizon. Earl swallowed hard, sitting down beside him. "You picked a good spot," he murmured. "She'd have liked you." The shepherd's tail moved once, just enough to stir the dust. The sun dipped lower, casting the ruins in a warm, golden light, the kind that made even broken things look whole again. Earl leaned back against the crumbling wall, the photo trembling beside him in the wind, and for the first time since the war, he felt something he hadn't dared to in years' peace. The sun was lowering behind the Nevada hills, painting the sky in bruised gold and violet. The desert air had cooled to a hush, and even the wind seemed to slow as if it too was waiting for something to end. Earl sat on the crumbled porch step of what was once his home, the last glow of daylight stretching across the dirt like a long goodbye. Beside him, Scout rested with his head on Earl's boot, eyes half-closed, chest rising in slow, even breaths. The air smelled faintly of sage and dry wood, the scent of a life long gone, but not forgotten. Earl held the old letter in his hands, the one he had unearthed from the tin box days ago. The edges were softer now, from being unfolded red, and held too many times. He looked at the familiar handwriting, traced the curves of each letter with his thumb, then unfolded it one last time. The paper caught the breeze gently, as though it too breathed. He began to read, voice low and trembling. "My dear boy," his mother had written, "you don't have to be a hero. Just remember how to love." He stopped there, swallowing hard. The words blurred through the sting of tears, and before he could stop himself, one fell onto the paper, spreading through the faded ink. It had been 20 years since Earl Jennings last cried. Not since the day the war took Reyes, not since he'd buried his uniform and his heart in the same stretch of sand, but now sitting on the skeleton of the porch where his mother once stood waiting for him, the dam inside finally broke. The tears came slow at first, then steady, hot trails cutting through the dust on his face. He pressed the letter against his chest, gripping it with both hands, as if to anchor himself to the moment, to the woman whose voice he could almost hear again, soft and forgiving. "You were right, Ma," he whispered. "I thought I had to carry it all. The guilt, the noise, the silence. But maybe all I ever had to do was love again." He let out a shaky laugh, small and broken. "And I guess I forgot how." He turned his gaze toward Scout, who was watching him now, eyes gentle and knowing like he understood every word without needing to. But he didn't, Earl murmured. He never forgot. Scout blinked slowly, then shifted closer, pressing his head more firmly against Earl's leg. Earl ran his fingers through the dog's fur, feeling the warmth beneath the dust, the heartbeat still steady. "You saved me more than once, you know that," he said softly. "Dragged me out of the storm, out of the past. Hell, you even dragged me back to her." The wind stirred again, curling through the ruins, carrying the faint whisper of something almost like a sigh. Earl smiled faintly through the tears. "She'd have liked you," he said, voice cracking. "You've got her kind of soul, quiet, stubborn, full of mercy." He tilted his head back, looking at the sky. The first star had appeared small, but certain, hanging over the ridge. "Funny thing about mercy," he said quietly. "You think it's weakness until it's all you've got left. Then you realize it's the only thing that ever made you strong." He looked down again. Scout's breathing had slowed his body perfectly still, except for the soft rhythm of his chest. His eyes were half shut now, not from pain, but from peace. Earl's voice softened to a whisper. "Hey, don't you go leaving me now," he said, rubbing the dog's shoulder. "Not when we finally figured it out." But Scout didn't move. His eyes stayed closed mouth, relaxed, the faintest smile in the curve of his jaw. He wasn't gone, just resting like a soldier between battles. Earl exhaled the weight of it, both heavy and freeing. "You're tired," he said gently. "You've earned your rest." He leaned forward, resting his forehead against the dog's, the way he used to do with his men before a mission, a small ritual of trust. The air between them was warm and still. "You did your job, Scout," he whispered. "You brought me home." The words hung there suspended between them until the last of the sunlight slipped beneath the hills. The world grew quiet, the sky deepening into indigo. Earl sat there long after dark, one hand on Scout's back, the other clutching the letter against his heart. Somewhere a coyote called in the distance, lonely, but alive. He lifted his head and looked toward the stars, his voice breaking through the silence. "Mom was right," he said softly. "You don't have to be a hero. You just have to remember how to love." He looked down at Scout again, the dog's head still resting on his leg, his breath calm and even. "And you, boy, you reminded me." His voice cracked, but this time it wasn't sorrow that made it tremble. It was gratitude. He leaned back, shoulders against the wall that had once been his home, the desert around him vast and quiet, the night gentle for once. The letter fluttered in his hand as the breeze picked up rustling softly, the sound like a lullaby. Earl closed his eyes, listening. Maybe to the wind, maybe to her, maybe just to peace. The next morning the sun rose slow and golden over the Nevada desert. From the dirt road the ruins looked softer in the light. There was a man sitting on the old porch head, bowed, a letter pressed to his chest, and a German shepherd curled beside him asleep. The world had stopped spinning for them, if only for a moment, and in that stillness there was grace. If this story stayed with you, take a moment before you scroll. Hit, like if you believe compassion can bring even the most broken hearts home. Subscribe for more stories of loyalty, redemption, and the quiet power of love that still survives in this world. Tell me what moment touched you the most. The letter, the storm, or the way Scout finally found his way back. I'd love to hear what stayed with you after the desert went silent.